the topic doesn't need any statement about it. It's of deep interest to everyone. All of you are familiar with most of the ramifications and questions that are involved. Our guest is, as we've said, the Ambassador of France to the United States. He has held two fascinating and appropriate and intertwined positions prior to becoming ambassador. He was President Chirac's diplomatic advisor and Sherpa for 6 years, prior to going to the United Nations for 2 years as France's ambassador there. Obviously, connections which have so much to do with the discussions of the recent past. His diplomatic career is distinguished. He joined the Foreign Service in 1970 after receiving a law degree and having studied at the Institute of Political Science and the National School for Oriental Languages, studying Chinese and Indonesian. He was posted early in his career in both Hong Kong and Beijing. He served in a variety of posts within the Foreign Ministry. He's been in their Office of Economic Affairs. He served as the Deputy Director of the West African sector. He served as Director of the Asia-Pacific Affairs sector and has been head of the cultural, scientific, and technological group within the Foreign Ministry. He's also served early in his career in the office of the President of the Republic. He served as a Deputy Executive Assistant to the Foreign Minister, and then, as I said, for 6 years as President Chirac's diplomatic advisor. He was posted early in his career to the United Nations. Then he served as France's ambassador to the United Nations in Geneva, and then, as I said, more recently, as ambassador of France to the United Nations. It's been a most distinguished career with fascinating positions within Paris as well as overseas. And now we have before us not only the distinguished ambassador, but a wonderful question and a most interesting topic. It's my great pleasure to present the Ambassador of France, Jean-David Levitte.
Thank you very much. I feel very old listening to you. But I'm delighted to be with you tonight. You mentioned my previous post, and it's true, I was for 2 years in New York as the French ambassador to the United Nations, and on 9/11, I was in my office at the 44th floor of a wonderful building with a wonderful view on downtown. So I saw from my office the destruction of the Twin Towers. And at that moment, I was the president of the Security Council of the United Nations. With all my collaborators, we were glued to the windows, looking as Americans, I would say, to the tragedy, and at the same time, as president of the council, I wondered, what can we do? What can we do confronted with such a huge shock for the American people? It was obviously worse than Pearl Harbor. And what we did is, as good diplomats, to prepare a draft resolution for the Security Council. But it was an important resolution because it was a turning point for the world. We immediately knew that we were confronted with history. And what we prepared was a resolution which changed the international law. We proposed in that draft resolution to decide that such an act of international terror should be qualified as an act of war. And it was a first in international law to equal an act of international terror to an act of war, which paved the way to the right of that we should put in the text that this right of self-defense from the United States should be exercised not only against those who committed this act of international terror, but also against the states which equipped, trained, financed, and offered the hospitality to the terrorist network. This draft resolution was proposed to the other members of the Security Council at the very moment the doors of the United Nations building were opened. And 1 hour later, this draft resolution became Resolution 1368 of the Security Council. It was adopted unanimously. And I propose to my colleagues of the Security Council to adopt it not by raising our hands, but by standing in respect and tribute to the American people, and to express our admiration for the way the New Yorkers responded with courage, dignity, solidarity. We were so impressed that we wanted to show, as the United Nations, our admiration to the American people, and also our deep solidarity with the American people in a time of crisis. So, what happened then? Well, my answer to that question, which is in our minds when we read the Pew Research inquiry about the mood throughout the world, my answer as a European is as follows. The American people is at war, is really at war against terrorism. And living in the United States, I fully not only understand, but share this feeling. But for the outside world, for Europe, the perception is a bit different. 9/11 was a moment of unity throughout the world, but at the same time, the Europeans didn't feel the huge shock as you did in the United States. And for a Frenchman, confronted with Islamist terror for 20 years now, we are side by side in this war, but for us it's more, I would say, a low-intensity war. We have experienced in the 80s and in the 90s explosions in our streets. We were the victims of Al-Qaeda. They killed 11 French in Karachi a few months ago, and French died in Casablanca, terrorist acts during the explosions in Casablanca a few days ago. And we arrested dozens of Al-Qaeda terrorists in our streets a few weeks ago. But it's a kind of low-intensity war. So that is, in my view, the first difference. The American people is at war, and the world doesn't feel this kind of intense need to eradicate the scourge of terrorism. The second difference, it seems to me, is the question of sovereignty. As a European, building on the lessons of centuries of wars, we have decided all over Europe, but especially Germany and France, to build peacefully our common destiny. That's the European Union. And in 50 years, we've been very successful, to the point that all of us, 300 million Europeans now, have in their pocket euros. And euro is, in a way, the symbol of shared sovereignty. But shared sovereignty has become a way of life in Europe. You don't have one day without a council of ministers on agriculture, on justice or law and order, on defense or foreign affairs, and so on and so forth. We are not always successful, but to act in a shared sovereignty is a way of life for all Europeans. We share everything, with success, without success. If it is without success, well, the day after we'll try again, and this time with a bit more success. And when we look at global problems, like the protection of environment or trade or whatever, well, we think shared sovereignty. Because what we do at the European level, we want to do at the global level. So shared sovereignty is a way of life for most Europeans. Here, sovereignty is not something that you share, but something that you protect, especially against interference from the international institutions, and in particular the UN, as if the UN was a kind of international government above the nations. From my experience, let me say candidly that that's not exactly what I experienced in New York. The UN is the result of our collective action. And believe me, the United States have a lot of influence inside the United Nations as a whole. But the perception is somewhat different, especially in the Congress, in the administration. And we have to take into account this situation when we try to solve the problems of the world. We have a different perception on the question of sovereignty, as we do have a different perception on the question of war against terrorism. Against this background, let me say a word about Iraq. I will not go in the details of this long negotiation. I was a French negotiator of Resolution 1441 on the disarmament of Iraq. It was adopted unanimously after 8 weeks of good, tough negotiation. And when I presented my credentials to President Bush, he said, "Congratulations for what you did, achieved with John Negroponte, the US negotiator." It was on the 9th of December. What happened after? Why this unanimous resolution has erupted into such a big split? The answer to that question is not an easy one. Let me propose 3 explanations. The first thing which didn't happen and that we expected was a big mistake by Saddam Hussein himself, because in the past he never missed an opportunity to make a big mistake. He invaded Iran, he invaded Kuwait, he provoked the international community many times, but not this time. Not this time. And maybe he was scared, but the fact is that he cooperated with the international community. No door closed, as during the years of UNSCOM, when UNSCOM wanted to check what was going on in this or that palace and so on. Cooperation was the mood in Baghdad at that moment. The second surprise was that there was no smoking gun. What is a smoking gun? Well, you remember that Iraq had to provide a declaration of a final statement about what they had in terms of arms of mass destruction, and they provided a 12,000 pages declaration, basically saying we have no more arms of mass destruction. But there were a number of contradictions in this long text. And we were, all of us, expecting the smoking gun, or the smoking guns. That is, the proof that the Iraqi were cheating, lying. A stock of anthrax or VX. And I participated personally with John Wolf, the man that was just appointed to be your representative in the Middle East peace process and who was in charge of non-proliferation before, in a number of meetings to see how we could pass, you could pass, all the intelligence that you had about the arms of mass destruction programs of Iraq to the UN inspectors so that they could go and find these stocks. No smoking gun, nothing has been found. And the last thing which created an unexpected situation is the buildup of your armies around Iraq. The determination of President Bush helped us to get the return of inspectors. And we must thank President Bush for his determination, because without his speech in the UN, probably we would never have obtained the return of the inspectors. And certainly the presence of American troops around Iraq was a formidable pressure on the Iraqi regime to provide all the cooperation, because they knew what was the alternative. But precisely it became a problem when the Iraqi leaders were more and more cooperative. We got real disarmament. You have seen on your TV screens the destruction of missiles Al-Samud II. This was real disarmament. But at that moment, the buildup was nearing an end. And probably in Washington, the mood was, well, we are ready to go, we have to go. Because if we don't, we'll have to sit there for a number of weeks, and we don't know how long. And so there was, at that moment, a real difficulty in the Security Council, because for a majority of members, peaceful disarmament of Iraq through the UN inspections was becoming a real success story. We were obtaining real disarmament, and the mood for a majority of members was, let's continue. And for a minority, the mood was, well, we cannot go on like that forever. Let's stop and win the war. Now the war is over. We had, between a number of countries, a real difference of views. But now the war is over, and we have to implement what I learned in New York: think positive. It's two useful words for diplomats. Past is past. Let's turn this bitter page and let's think positive, because we have better things to do than to exchange bitter words forever. We have better things to do first in Iraq. It is so important to make Iraq a success story that we have to work together to get there. Where? Well, to build democracy, to build market economy, to make Iraq a success story and a good example for the whole Arab world. Second, we have to stay together on a number of important issues. And here I would like to remind everybody on one important thing. When the US need partners, where are they? when the US need troops to accompany your efforts, where do you find them? In China, in Russia, in Brazil or India? No, in Europe. And the US and Europe are side by side in Afghanistan and now in Iraq. The US have been going from one country to the other in Europe, but not beyond Europe to find, or basically not beyond Europe, to find the necessary partners to maintain law and order in Iraq. And we have to be together to eradicate the scourge of terrorism. This is a war. We all agree on that, even if for you it's high intensity and for the Europeans low intensity, but we agree on the objective. Our democracies are confronted with a real threat, and we will survive as democracies only if we can slowly but surely eradicate the scourge of terrorism. And let's not forget that in this fight, we represent the two pillars. In fact, we, as the US on one side, the Europeans on the other side, are the two strong pillars of world democracies. If we are together, nothing is impossible. If we are divided, it's a lose-lose situation. And by the way, it is exactly the same situation if you look at the US and the EU in the economic sphere. Together, we represent 62% of the world GDP. And our economies are so integrated that each day you have $3 billion of goods, services, and capital exchanged on both sides of the Atlantic. $3 billion a day. It is amazing. But at the same time, let's not forget that together we represent only 11% of the world population, 5% for the US, and 6% for the EU before the enlargement. So we are a minority of the world population, even if we represent together 62% of the world GDP. So if we are not united, economically speaking, also, it's a lose-lose situation. I hear that some would prefer a weak Europe divided. I think it would be a big mistake. What the US need in this dangerous world is a strong European partner. In the economic sphere, we have achieved what we wanted to do. We are a common market, we have a unified economy, and a common currency. Is it a disaster for the United States? Not at all. On the contrary, it is an asset. If you are the CEO of an American company, it's much better for this company to have in Europe a unified market and a common currency, because if you want to invest in Europe, it's much better. You can sell throughout Europe without borders, and you have one currency instead of 12 or 15 or 13. In my view, in military terms, it is exactly the same story. Of course, you can continue to do what you do today in Iraq, pick and choose, 3 Baltic states here, Poland there, some Ukrainians, some Spanish, and so on. And all in all, after long efforts, you get 20,000 troops, but with small contingents here and there, speaking 12 languages and not prepared to work together. In my view, that's not the best situation. What we have decided to do in Europe is to prepare for the end of this war this year, an integrated force of 60,000 troops ready to be deployed as one unity with a common structure integrated within the context of the Atlantic Alliance. And for the US, it seems to me it's much better to find in Europe an integrated force ready for use, either in Afghanistan or in Iraq or elsewhere, as a good partner for the United States. So when I hear that the idea of a multipolar world is criticized as a kind of offense to the United States because you represent a kind of unipolar world, and to try to build or to plead in favor of a multipolar world would be a kind of attempt to reduce the power of the United States, my view is somewhat different. And I say, no, look, economically speaking, the world is already multipolar. You have the United States, you have the European Union, you have Japan, you have emerging China, maybe tomorrow India and Brazil. And this economic multipolar world works well without problems. And when there are irritants like steel or bananas or other irritants, we have a rule for the game, that is the World Trade Organization. In military terms, we all know that the world is and will remain unipolar. And we don't, as Europeans, think it's a threat. On the contrary, in this dangerous world, we are threatened more by chaos, more by the threat of terrorism, and certainly not by a strong military might in this country. We need a strong military might in the United States. What is missing is a strong capacity in Europe, not to compete with the United States. We have certainly not the ambition to compete with the United States, militarily speaking. What we want to achieve is a reasonable integrated force in Europe to be in a position to solve the problems we have in Europe next door, like a few years ago in Bosnia or in Kosovo. It was quite humiliating for Jacques Chirac and Tony Blair to discover that we were not in a position as Europeans to solve the small problems of Kosovo next door to our borders a few years ago alone, without calling a reluctant President Clinton to our rescue and to help us. And I fully understood at that moment why President Clinton was reluctant. Why on earth the United States should start a war against Yugoslavia about Kosovo? It is not an important issue for the United States. But for the Europeans, it was of key importance because it was next door. And we could not accept in Europe again a kind of ethnic cleansing campaign. So we have to do better as Europeans in terms of military effort. We have to put more money and we have to integrate better our limited resources. That's what we are trying to do. It is certainly not to curb American power, but on the contrary, it is, in our view, a way to propose to the United States a better partner, more organized, more efficient. So, in our view, what we want to achieve in Europe is certainly not a threat to the United States, but on the contrary, an ambition to propose to the United States a better organized, strong partner in this dangerous world. And I'd like to conclude with one note about the French-American relations. I consider personally that this relation is a real treasure and that it must be protected and preserved and enhanced. Let's not forget that we were side by side in the early days of your independence, and Baltimore was the testimony among many other cities along this coast of our common fight. You saved us twice last century, and the French people will never forget. We will never forget, and we will remember especially tomorrow. Tomorrow is the anniversary of D-Day. And all over France, you will have thousands of celebrations of this anniversary, which is in our heart forever. And when I heard that in Evian, our two leaders met and had a very positive meeting and decided together to turn the bitter page of the last few months and to focus on what we have to do together, as I mentioned, to try to eradicate the scourge of terrorism, to give a boost together to the peace process in the Middle East, to fight together the risk of the spread of arms of mass destruction coming from maybe Iran or North Korea. In one word, when I heard that they had a very constructive meeting and together we've decided to think positive, then I was the happiest ambassador. Thank you.
Would you comment on the non-proliferation effort to prevent a nuclear disaster?
Yes, I think it is the key question because, of course, we all know that we are also under the threat of chemical weapons and biological weapons. But by far, the nuclear threat is, it seems to us, the most ominous one. We cannot address that issue with one simple answer. What we have to do is to build a kind of global coalition to solve it through different means. The first one, in my view, is to implement the treaties that have been negotiated. I say that because I know that in the United States, the treaties are considered from time to time more as a kind of problem than a kind of solution. In our view, as Europeans, as I said, we have considered that treaties are useful, and we still consider that the non-proliferation treaty offers a good way forward. But beyond that, we have signed a number of protocols which, if implemented, will allow the inspectors of the IAEA, the Vienna agency, to go in Iran, for instance. If Iran could accept the deployment of the IAEA inspectors throughout the that is, if Iran could accept to sign not only the NPT, which is done, but also the additional protocol called 93+2, that is, if Iran could accept to have a deployment of inspectors beyond what is mandatory with the NTP, then it would propose an element of solution. Second, we have to keep in mind that, contrary to what some people say, the UN inspections in Iraq did a good job. It is accepted as truth in the United States that the UN inspections during the 8 years where they were working in Iraq, between 91 and 98, destroyed more arms of mass destruction than the first Gulf War itself. They did a good job. And in our view, the UNMOVIC inspectors, when they were deployed the last few months in Iraq did also a good job. Some say, well, they didn't find all the arms, but the fact is that since the war, nobody has found all these arms. And I would be very encouraged if the UNMOVIC inspectors were invited soon to join the US inspectors to try to solve the question marks which are still there about these programs in Iraq. And if tomorrow we could obtain in North Korea the deployment of UN inspectors well-trained and well-equipped, as it was the case in Iraq, with access not only to the Yongbyon reactors, but as we obtained it in Iraq, to all the buildings throughout the territory, without exceptions, including the palaces of Kim Jong-il, as it was the situation in Iraq, I think we would be quite reassured about the situation in North Korea. So treaties are useful. Let's not forget that the inspections are useful. And of course, what we need also is a kind of global coalition to convince some governments that they make a mistake by trying to get nuclear arms, and that there is a better way to provide peace to the world and also to protect themselves. And these ways can be explored through diplomatic channels. And that's exactly what is being done right now in North Korea, and maybe tomorrow, I hope, with Iran.
Is increased European defense spending a panacea?
That is a resume which is a bit provocative. We, as I said, we don't want to compete with the United States, militarily speaking. We have not this ambition. But we must recognize as Europeans that simply because we felt protected by our alliance, we have not done enough, militarily speaking. And since the end of the Soviet Empire, the threat has disappeared, the threat of the Soviet Empire. And the withdrawal of American troops has already started. In fact, two-thirds probably of the American troops have already left Europe for good reason. The Soviet threat has disappeared. Does it mean that we don't need anymore a NATO? Not at all. And that is not the French view. You have to know that the first diplomatic initiative taken by President Chirac when he was elected in 1995 was to start a negotiation with the US to have France as, again, a full member of NATO. Because we consider as French that the alliance is and will remain for decades the cornerstone of our security. And now, as we speak, France is the first contributor of troops to NATO operations, the first one, before the US, before the UK, Germany, Italy. So NATO alliance is not a problem for us. What we need is to build a strong pillar, a strong European pillar in this alliance, because a weak pillar is a problem for the Europeans and for the US. And we see it in Iraq today. We have no objection to see a role for NATO in Iraq. We have accepted it. And NATO will play a role to help the Poles to organize themselves. No problem also for the use of NATO in Kabul. And that's what we have accepted a few weeks ago. But the problem is that Europe is not there. You have France, you have Germany, and so on. We have decided, as France, to put a lot of money, a lot more money, in our defense. Tony Blair took the same decisions, and we hope that the others will follow suit, and that together we will build a stronger, limited European defense power. And I see it as a necessity for the Europeans and as a good answer to the imbalance which exists today in NATO.
Is there a rift between Great Britain, England, or France? And France.
Well, my mother is British, and she told me, right or wrong, my brother. And for more than 1,000 years now, our British friends, cousins, and brothers are our friends, cousins, and brothers. And we may disagree on a number of issues. It doesn't mean that we cannot work together. In fact, I'm pretty confident that the relations between Jacques Chirac and Tony Blair will soon be as good as they were a few months ago. And Tony Blair is, in my view, a real convinced European. And he took the initiative to give a boost to the European defense with Jacques Chirac. And in fact, we started together. At that time, it was John Major in Bosnia. We were upset by the impossibility to end the war in Bosnia. The US didn't want to interfere. They were out. We had lost, as France, 60 soldiers killed and 600 wounded. And when President Chirac was elected, there were hundreds of soldiers from a dozen of nations attached to trees, naked and humiliated. And Jacques Chirac said, enough is enough, let's do better. He called John Major, and together we created the Rapid Reaction Force. And we said to Milosevic, now the rule of the game has changed. And the rule of the game changed. There was NATO intervention after the Rapid Reaction Force from Britain and France was deployed. And after 3 months only, we signed the Dayton Agreement. We did the same in Kosovo. And you know that in Saint-Malo, a city as a symbol of French-British rivalry and friendship, in Saint-Malo, we launched the initiative which triggered the defense effort of the European Union. So we had a strong disagreement not only with the US but with the UK on the necessity of the war in Iraq. For us, this war was not necessary. It was not necessary because we didn't see the threat, the imminent threat against our people. We didn't see any link between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda and so on. But this difference of views is now past story. And with our British friend as well as with our American friends, we have decided to focus on the future and on the need to make Iraq a success story, as I said.
What is the position of France on Eastern European countries in general, specifically joining the EU?
Well, of course, we are in favor of a Europe, one, at peace and democratic. And we have fought a lot to achieve that goal, and we are near the end of this success story. In fact, when the ambassadors of the European Union meet now in Washington, and we had a breakfast this morning with Senator Lugar, we are 25. 25 ambassadors around Senator Lugar. That's the Europe of tomorrow. It will even grow a bit further with probably in a few years' time with Bulgaria and Romania and even Turkey joining. That is our goal. What President Chirac said weeks ago is not that. He said that it was a pity to see Europe split on an issue which was not the war in Iraq, but the transatlantic relations. What happened is that some members of the European Union took the initiative of what was called the Letter of the Eight. To be candid with you, it's common knowledge, Tony Blair and Aznar took the initiative of a letter, and it was published in the press without being presented to the presidency of the European Union and to the other partners. And the Greek, the presidency of the European Union, were quite upset to discover in some papers that there was a letter signed by half of Europe and not the other one. And then the 10 of Vilnius, and that was the problem, signed another letter. And those two letters were about the transatlantic relations. And President Chirac was upset because we had no problem. We could have signed one letter or the other if we had been proposed to sign it. And what he said is that those who took these two initiatives, but especially he mentioned the second one because it was the problem of the day, missed an opportunity. And so our hope is that for the future, if some member of the European Union has the good idea to propose a letter about the transatlantic relation and our transatlantic cooperation, this initiative will be proposed to all the members through the presidency, and starting July 1st, it will be after Greece, Italy. So basically, that was his message. He was upset by the fact that these two letters were not proposed to the full membership of the European Union. But I say it again, our goal, stated for many, many years, is to have the European Union encompassing all the democracies in Europe. And we are nearly near that goal. If Poland votes yes this Saturday and Sunday, it will be a great success following a number of successful referenda in Eastern Europe. And our hope, our prayers are that a majority of the poll will go to vote and will vote yes.
Question with respect to the American approach to the roadmap and France's approach to the roadmap. Do you intend in any way to ignore Mr. Arafat?
First, we applaud the initiative taken by President Bush. Not only we applaud, but we admire his determination. And we support, as France, but also as Europe, wholeheartedly, his initiative, and we share his determination and his hope for peace in the Middle East. Second, the roadmap is the common proposal of the United States, Europe, Russia, and the United Nations to the two parties, Israel on one side and the Palestinian people on the other side. Now, on Arafat, we have a nuance. You have decided, President Bush has decided, not to meet and to prevent any leader or member of this administration to meet with Yasser Arafat because he failed his people. We, as Europe, and its position of all the European countries, have a different view, not about the failure of Arafat to build peace, but about the way to deal with Arafat today. He's been elected as the president of the Palestinian Authority. He has appointed a prime minister, but he retains a lot of power in terms of security and in terms of money. And he can do a lot of damage to Abu Mazen at the very moment we must help Abu Mazen to succeed. So we ask ourselves, is the best way to deal with Arafat is to isolate him, with the risk of encouraging him to play a destructive role, or should we maintain contacts with him to encourage him to be positive? We know your answer, the answer of the administration, and our answer is, for the time being, we should maintain contacts with him. Is this difference a problem? I don't think so, and I may propose that on some issues, disagreement could propose a kind of constructive answer. You have decided not to see him. We maintain that it's good to see him. I think both are conducting to the same result. And you have to know that Abu Mazen himself has told us, Europeans, please maintain your contacts because I need help from Arafat. Otherwise, I'm politically dead. And as long as Abu Mazen will tell us that, I think that the Europeans will maintain contacts with Arafat.
Discuss France's debt from Iraq, and was it a factor in your decision to oppose the war on Iraq?
I'm delighted you asked this question because it provides me an opportunity to give you some figures. First, the debt. Iraq owes France $1.7 billion in capital. Iraq owes the United States more. The debt of Iraq vis-à-vis France is lower than the debt of Iraq vis-à-vis the United States of America. Second, we were not the first or the second or the third economic partner in Iraq. We were the 13th partner of Iraq during these last months and years. And it represented 0.2% of our trade, our exports. Third, we were not buying Iraqi oil in great quantities. If you look at the exports, the oil exports of Iraq, only 8% of the total was going to France, and 56% was going to the United States of America. And last but not least, you know that we have decided together in the Security Council a few days ago to prolong the existence of the Oil for Food program to feed the Iraqi people, which are dependent. 60% of the Iraqi people is dependent of the Oil for Food program of the UN today. And you know that there is $7 billion of contract signed in this Oil for Food program, $7 billion. If you look at the statistic of the UN, you will see that only $230 million are French contracts, French companies. That is less than 3% of the total. So I'm delighted to give you all these figures because it shows that our opposition to this war was certainly not the result of economic interest.
Would you comment upon the gravity of the situation in Africa, specifically the Congo?
Yes. As ambassador to the Security Council of the UN, I led 3 missions of the 15 ambassadors of the Security Council to the Great Lakes region. That is, 3 times we visited not only the DRC, but also the 7 countries which are involved in this war. And you have to know that in the last 4 years, 3 million inhabitants of the DRC died from this war. Not only from the fights, but from the whole collapse of the state infrastructures. And to visit the DRC is to visit the worst place on earth. It's a real disaster. It's a real collapse of the economy, the state structures. Can you believe that in Kisangani, for instance, or in Bandaka, these are 2 cities of 600,000 inhabitants. You don't have electricity, you don't have drinking water, you don't have oil, so you don't have cars, but you don't have sugar or salt or clothes. It's beyond what you can imagine. So, as nobody cared, we thought that this Security Council should do something. And with the agreement of our governments, we went in the region to help the governments involved to put an end to this tragedy. And we have deployed UN troops in the country to help the governments of the region to implement a ceasefire. And it was a success story, and now they are on the verge of establishing in Kinshasa a government of transition towards elections and peace. And there is a ceasefire all over the Congo now, with one exception, near the border of Uganda and Rwanda, that is the Ituri region, and especially Bunia, where two tribes, the Hema and the Lendu, are fighting each other. These are ethnic fightings, but fueled by economic reasons and a lot of armaments coming from outside countries. And so, because of the threat of massacres, Kofi Annan proposed that we should send in Bunia, in this small town near the border of Uganda and Rwanda, a force, a UN force, not under the mandate of MONUC, but a special force for Bunia to stop the killings. And we have accepted to be the lead nation for this operation. And the EU, the European Union, has accepted for the second time to make it a European force, together with some African contributions like the South African and few others. And this force is being deployed in a matter of days. But it will be a very difficult mission, because we have the mission to protect the inhabitants of Bunia, which is a small city of 200,000 inhabitants. But what will happen if there are killings beyond Bunia? And that is not our mandate. So we have not only to deploy these troops in Bunia with the backing of the international community, but also to bring the peace process to an end, to a successful conclusion. Otherwise, the fightings could continue beyond Bunia in the eastern part of the Congo. But I'm glad that you mentioned that, because nobody cares about the crisis in Africa, or not enough. And it's very reassuring to see that in this country, we have a wonderful partnership. The US and France, you have to know that, are working hand in hand to put an end to African crisis, the Congo, but also Sierra Leone, Ivory Coast, Ethiopia and Eritrea, Somalia, if possible.
The cynics often suggest that the French would like power to be distributed according to the strength of diplomacy. The ambassador, I think in his marvelous articulation, has shown us why the cynics think that.